Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
We'd like to thank our sponsor, Monheim Microphones. Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. They recently released their new royalty microphone, Monheim Microphones Unparalleled Excellence, monheimmicrophones.com.
Hear from the most influential and innovative voices in today's global garden community at the annual Andalusia Garden Symposium. Famed plantsman and garden writer Dan Hinckley, Sissinghurst's head gardener Troy Scott Smith, Welsh seasonal floral designer and author Lucy Hunter, and edible landscape architect and author Stephanie Bittner. Held on Friday, May 3rd at Andalusia Historic House, Gardens, and Arboretum in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. Tickets are on sale now at andalusiapa.org.
This podcast is being recorded on January 26, 2024. David Muffly has been planting trees in the Bay Area and other California locations for more than 30 years. Dave began his tree career where he received his undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering, Stanford University. Moving from engineering to ecology, Dave managed native oak plantings at Stanford with the nonprofit Magic in a project that has yielded more than 4,000 established oaks in 40 years. Dave then branched into fruit trees and urban tree plantings with a special focus on street trees. Dave subsequently became a Board Certified Master Arborist and designed and oversaw the 101 Freeway Soundwall planting as part of the East Palo Alto tree initiative led by the nonprofit Canopy. This radical and experimental 1,000 tree drought adaptation planting succeeded far beyond expectations and laid the foundation for the changes reverberating through the California tree nursery industry today. The East Palo Alto Tree Initiative became the proof of concept for the even more radically diverse plantings at Apple Park in Cupertino, where Dave spent 7 years as Apple's senior arborist. Today, Dave works as a senior arborist and horticultural futurist. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Dave. We're delighted that you can be with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes, welcome, Dave Muffly. And I have to say, I don't know why we haven't had you on much earlier. Reading about you and doing some research, I thought, what an amazing man. I can't wait to speak with him. Dave, tell us a little bit about your background. Are you California grown? And tell us about your journey to oak trees and becoming an arborist in the Palo Alto area.
Okay, well, get ready for a weird story. So I started out in a town of 1,200 people in rural Nebraska, where my dad was the town doctor for 45 years. And I was kind of a late life caboose child who showed up in the mid-60s, and everybody in the family had other stuff to do, and there was hardly anybody in the town. So little Dave spent a lot of time with the television between 1967 and about 1977. So that was me, but I was hungry for information. I was an early science fiction nerd. So it's kind of funny when I look back at my history and how I got into trees, there's a whole component around science fiction of the late 60s, early 70s, kind of the apocalyptic sci-fi. So that's some kind of weird, deep history of me. I was a smart little kid, kind of smart as anybody'd ever met. So I made my way through high school, and it was small, rural, public high school, and it was about the easiest thing in the world. But I did well enough, and I did lots of activities. And so once it came time to apply for schools, my dad by then was a successful doctor. I was clearly smarter than anybody they'd run across. So they decided, sure, you can go to school wherever you want. And then I began searching without any live humans for guidance, because I was in the middle of nowhere well before the internet. So I just got the books at the B. Dalton bookstores and read about every college in America. And you give a kid a choice and he goes to Stanford. So that's how I ended up there. I could have gone to Brown. I could have gone to Stanford, but the hippies and Birkenstocks throwing frisbees, that was my jam. So I left my little town and went to Stanford University in the mid-1980s. And there it was pretty interesting. I have a mechanical engineering degree from Stanford, which is, as you can guess, that's a non-trivial accomplishment. And I'm not really that great at math. I'm okay at all that stuff because I got through, but I was by no means exemplary. And I was always exploring the edges of things. And turned out by the time I got to the end, I realized I didn't really like doing problem sets. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life sitting in a cubicle. So I just kind of took off after college, like many young people do, spent some time with a friend in Fayetteville, Arkansas. But in 1989, right after the first headlines about global warming, I decided to head back to the Stanford area because I couldn't find a place in Arkansas. It was a terrible fit for me. So I didn't know where else to go. Wasn't going back to rural Nebraska, that's for darn sure. So I went back to the Stanford area with a mind to get into public service. And I was already leaning toward ecological type service, but I really did a broad search. Stanford had an excellent public service entity, and I went to them and I started testing out all kinds of public service. But what I really wanted was to be outside on a weekend doing physical work that got me to breathe air and meet people. I wanted to find a way to hook in. It was the Haas Center for Public Service at Stanford, which was extremely well developed at that. But then one day I was at the Haas Center and I read this ad looking for volunteers to water oak trees in the Stanford University foothills. Stanford has a big 880-acre open space between the main campus and the 280 freeway. And it has an elevation change of about 400 feet. So it's kind of a classic coastal mountain foothill situation. And I hooked up with the funny little kind of pseudo hippie group called Magic. And they're really not well named because they're all kind of hardcore scientists. But when you do science right, it's kind of like magic. Anyway, they were under contract with the university, and by 1989, their initial attempts to plant had frankly largely failed. In the mid-1980s, they planted 1,000 native oaks using what were then the standard reforestation techniques of the day, which hilariously was a half-gallon milk carton, top and bottom cut off below the ground with an aluminum screen cage on the top. Well, they planted 1,000 trees in likely habitat. That was standard in California back then. I don't think we have many survivors from that period because it really didn't work. But what we learned quickly was that the ground squirrels on this Stanford land, because the land was cut off from the wildlands by a freeway, there really weren't any big predators there. There really weren't even deer, which was pretty weird. So in the absence of competition, the ground squirrels had proliferated to like mega city size because all those beautiful yellow hillsides, the California summer, that's almost all Lavina fatua, semi-domesticated oats. So the ground squirrels harvest the billions of acres of oak grain fields that we call the hillsides of California. So anyway, we had to deal with absurd populations of ground squirrels. Ground squirrels would eat through cardboard. Eventually, we found that they would eat straight through the aluminum. So by 1988, the people at Magic, who were smart, Stanford trained, Ivy League trained, kind of super hippies, they're pretty smart. They upgraded the protection devices, improved their methods, and they went in about a year from about a 20% survival rate to about an 80% survival rate. So that was the beginning of the protocols that have come to dominate tree planting at Stanford. We're still using the same protocols today. And now that I have re-entered the restoration industry, I am utterly shocked to find that no one has redeveloped our protocol. It's still the cutting edge 30 years later. And I'm honestly dumbfounded. I plugged into that learning kind of rocket, and that is the basis for my career.
Fantastic.
Wow. That is really a journey.
I want to make sure, as we always do, we always have the links when we post your podcast, but Oaktopia, your website, is wonderful. It's a real resource for anyone that likes oaks, that has an interest in rewilding and assisted migration. And it does seem, when I read about you and look through the website, that you are really, as you've just described, not only with planting protocols with an 80% success rate, but also very much engaged with everything Quercus in terms of establishment and also assisted migration. So why don't we move in that direction a little bit, Dave? Tell us about some of that work.
Okay. Well, here we were at Stanford. In about 1990, there was a burst of interest in environmentalism during that period. That was the Earth Day 1990. And I kind of got sucked right into that. So there was a lot of interest. We had a lot of volunteers in those years. But we had to decide what trees we were going to plant. And even back then, we were limited by the paradigm of local native, and we were fine with that. But we were also some of the first people I know of who were aware of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
We were integrating climate change into our choices in 1989. So there are 3 kinds of oaks that grow on the land at Stanford. One of them's an evergreen. 2 of them are deciduous. And we simply, because we didn't know where the climate was going to go then, we didn't have any of the details. We just had a feeling things were going to be shifting, and there would be no way to predict which of these species would be the ones that would thrive within the potentially multi-century lifespan of an oak tree. So we put all 3 species in every single site we planted. And we did that, I think, for close to 2,000 trees. So we didn't really think about it, but we did a hardcore competitive scientific test of the 3 species. And what we learned was that the smaller of the deciduous trees was literally being driven to extirpation. We could barely find acorns. Any seedlings we got powdery mildew.
This was blue oak, right?
This was blue oak. Blue oak, we saw trouble. And I was the guy collecting the acorns. So I knew the process intimately. So the blue oaks went nowhere. The valley oaks would grow. And 1991, I remember in November, we put a valley oak into a 5-foot 2x tree shelter. And then we'd survey, of course, the following summer to keep track of our success. And we were shocked to find a valley oak that was 2 feet out of a 5-foot tree shelter in 8 months. So everybody was telling me, and the common urban legend is oaks are slow growing. Well, the reality is there's more than 500 species of oaks on the planet, more than 1,800 named hybrids, and the mature size of those roughly, 2,500 types range from a mature height of like 3 feet to a mature height that approaches 200 feet. So I got to see one of the fast ones take off, and that tree taught me the trees can grow way faster than anybody in the industry believes if you get the conditions absolutely right. And because I was at kind of the pointy end of a good scientific process, we did good comparisons.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the idea of oaks being slow growers. When people say that, it's at the time that they look at it rather than the various ages of the tree, because trees grow fast like people do. They grow different times of their life, will speed up and then slow down and then speed up again and then slow down again. And I think that people have a lot of misconceptions about how trees grow. And I think that's what you're telling us now when you're talking about the valley oak.
Exactly. So the blue oak's out of the game. So now we have the California valley oak, which is one of the largest oak species in the world, versus the widespread, the ubiquitous coast live oak, Quercus agrifolia. And agrifolia is everywhere in the 50 miles from the Pacific Ocean, from Baja to Mendocino. It totally dominates our coastal zone. So, of course, we used them. They're easy. They're an invasive weed to some of us. But then the next learning was really something. Some of those valley oaks would grow fast, but the truth is, almost 100% of the time, if there was a coast live oak with a valley oak, that coast live oak would just way outgrow the valley oak and swallow it alive. So in the early 2000s, I actually did a contract for Stanford where I pruned 1,500 young oak trees on the wildlands. So I pruned essentially all of our trees in the wildlands. And this gave me a huge learning opportunity because I had to go stare at each and every tree and decide what to do to it. And I quickly discovered that virtually all the valley oaks were being overtopped by the evergreen coast live oak. And I actually attempted in some cases to top the coast live oaks to attempt to let the valley oak grow, because the valley oak is rarer, it's cooler. We didn't just want to plant coast live oaks, but that was what was happening.
What was your spacing, Dave? What was the spacing on those trees that you were pruning?
So 15-foot spacing seems to be where we end up.
Okay.
Let me give you a more interesting answer. So when we built the Apple Park campus, we had 100 acres of landscape that was just dirt. And we planted 60 acres of oak woodland. So it was 9,000, that was big. That was the biggest money anybody's ever spent on trees. But we had to make it up. And we were having huge debates about tree spacing, just as you can imagine. So the way that I said, okay, how are we going to solve this? I said, okay, grab a couple tape measures. We're going to the nearest open space, and we're going to start measuring the distances between the trunks of mature oaks. And we're going to base this in what happens in the land around here. Just like Steve Jobs told me to do, make it like around here. So we found crazy things. We'd find mature valley oaks next to mature coast live oaks, and they were 2 feet apart. Both of them had 3-foot trunks. So what we saw was that there would be long gaps because it's California and we're savanna, and only certain locations can support trees. But in the good soil areas, the trees are relatively packed together. So the way it played out was that our 15-foot spacing was kind of okay. And we more or less used the same at Apple Park. And people ask me this all the time, and I kind of throw up my hands. But then I explain to them, if you space oak trees, if you space trees for a mature size that doesn't occur for a century, you're going to be bummed out for the rest of your life. So I encourage people who want a quick effect. Everybody thinks that somehow trees run into each other, that they like battle. And apparently nobody has noticed the phenomena called canopy shyness. They avoid each other.
I love that. Yeah.
Yes.
So you can plant trunks close together, and then you get like a giant version of a single tree much faster.
And this is where we get into the tiny forest in Milwaukee, right? It's canopy shyness and let the trees figure it out.
Yeah. So I guess we were kind of doing a version of Milwaukee 30 years ago. And I don't really go for the hyper close spacing. That's somebody else's game. I've spaced trees in every environment and I've watched them grow. So I got my own way of doing things, but they were based in the same set of ideas.
Yeah.
And it's pretty different to apply those techniques to a forest in Japan versus a 15-inch rainfall a year wildland hillside in California. They really aren't quite the same, kids.
The gentleman who started Milwaukee actually did it in Hiroshima, which is where he started to replace the trees. And I'm sure you're aware of this. I would think, and it would make sense to me, that I would plant them closer together because even if he loses some, he knows he's going to get some, you know?
Exactly.
And especially with radioactivity or nuclear activity, that there would maybe be some that they're going to lose anyway. That's what I'm kind of thinking, and why Milwaukee is so close together. It's like 18 inches apart.
Yeah. Well, and it's rainfall based. You know, there's something people don't seem to understand that I think is a really valuable idea, which is that if you're in a wet environment, your trees tend to evolve toward height because they're battling each other for sunlight. If water is not your limiter, then sunlight becomes, there is a limiting element to every environment. Well, if water is your limiter, then the plants tend to be much more widely spaced, and the competition for the trees, rather than being other trees, becomes browsers, the things that eat the leaves. So that's why so many oaks from the wildlands, drylands go through this like multi-decadal shrub phase before they can get a leader above browse height. And one of the tricks that we used with those Tubex tree shelters, so nobody in California seems to have figured out how to use them because everybody wants to take the Tubexes off as soon as the tree comes out. But no. You leave the Tubex on until the tree splits it off. But what the Tubex does is that it guides the trees away from the shrub stage. It just skips the multi-decades of shrub and sends the tree directly to tree form. So we're getting stunning growth on our trees at Stanford. I mean, I've got trees in wildlands that I collected the acorns 35 years ago that are 50 and 60-foot trees that haven't been irrigated in 30 plus years.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's really something. Now, we have the Tubex here too. They use them along stream banks where they'll have the tube and the tree planted, and to get that. And we have here in southeastern Pennsylvania, in Bucks County in particular, I do believe it's the highest population of deer in the country. And it's true. More than one family member hits a deer in their lifetime on the road. But the browse is just unbelievable. The browse is what usually takes them out.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. The browse, getting over the browse is a critical stage. And with our Tubex, a funny thing happened where I managed the project for a long time and then went away for like 5 years and came back and managed it. The interim manager had removed all the tree shelters from thousands of our oaks, and immediately they began getting girdled by voles. We started losing trees in quantity. So I then, as the new manager, had to organize about 30 volunteer sessions to put all the Tubexes back on.
That could not have been fun.
Yeah, well, because the trees were dying, there was the payback of otherwise it's dead. So you just do what you got to do sometimes.
Well, and it's the experience behind what you were doing that made you realize how important those tubes were. And when somebody else comes along and they don't have that experience, they don't realize why you have them on.
Exactly.
They're just not knowledgeable.
Yep.
If we get back to that planting, then I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we're talking the Stanford campus still, where you inherited a site that was substandard and disturbed. Can you talk about, if anything, you did in terms of site preparation?
So here, this will get into one of the critical points of my career, really. So we did pretty simple soil prep, especially in the beginning, where we'd go out with a 10-inch diameter auger. Sometimes I hate hand augers. I think they're better today, but we'd go out with like bobcats with big augers mounted on them. And we'd try to punch a hole, 2 to 3 feet deep, 10 inches in diameter, because our tubexes were inside a metal screen cage that was a tube that was 1.5 feet below ground, 1.5 feet above ground. And that was what's called aviary wire or aviary netting. We went through a whole process to determine what kind of wire to use. And the aviary netting is perfect. So they were merged together. So we would have protection for the tree from 18 inches below ground to 5 feet above ground. And, sometimes we threw fertilizer tabs in. I'm not a fertilizer guy. I'm a soils guy. So we're very scattered in our initial plantings because honestly, the people who were laying it out were Yale lawyers and Stanford mechanical engineers and civil engineers.
That's a good team.
So we just kind of copied where the seedlings were growing. And the few seedlings that were on the land were kind of under the mother trees. But what we learned is that when you plant under the mother trees, for those little ones to grow, mama has to actually die. So she shades them out. We never got any growth directly under the canopies of the mature trees. So one of our first learnings was to move the plantings away from the mature trees and put them in the sun. Totally simple horticulture 101. You got to make sure you have sunlight. So when we'd plant, we'd mix in a little bit of kind of basic compost soil because there was a lot of rock up there on top of the ridge. And we'd end up having to replace the rock with soil volume. But we didn't, that was about it. Basic compost thrown into a planting hole.
Right.
Really good berms and really good consistent watering is really, really the key. But I told you the bit about a bunch of us who were untrained, just planting all over the place. We also planted in places where the wild grasses would never get very tall in the summer. And what we learned was that, the grasses don't get very tall because there's only about 3 inches of soil down there. And you can't hope to grow a tree in that. So we planted our trees in places where the grass barely grew, but we also planted our trees where the wild mustard would grow 9 feet tall. So all your annual plants are soil indicators. And if you want to grow a big drought-tolerant tree, you got to have a lot of rootable soil volume. You're not doing it on top of a rocky ridge with 4 inches of soil. So what I learned in the later years of the project was to read the vegetation and plant only where the, quote, invasive exotics were. Everybody's trying to eradicate invasive exotics, which I've literally never seen work. But what we did was that we just stuck our oaks right into the fields of mustard and thistle. And what we learned was that an oak will put down a deeper taproot than a mustard plant. So once that taproot gets below the mustard, suddenly the top of the tree is above the mustard. And suddenly the oak is shading the mustard out and literally pushing it back purely through blocking sunlight. So what we have done in areas there, and this is a very little discussed restoration technique, is that we've converted the, quote, invasive exotics into oak woodland. Because these plants, they're just telling us about the land and what we have done to the land. If you're looking for an invasive exotic organism, if you're looking for the keystone invasive exotic organism on planet Earth, all you need to do is look in the mirror. So I learned that I don't kill any plants. The plants are talking to us. They're telling us how to make a better future. But seemingly there are very few people who are able to listen. So one of my critical messages of my career is to try to tell people, watch the other plants, watch the plants everyone hates, and learn your soil profiles and put your big trees where the soil's deep and the groundwater is accessible. And then you get to succeed.
So are you saying that invasive exotics are indicator plants for disturbed soils? Is that the point you're trying to make?
Yeah, but at this point in human history, I don't know if there is any undisturbed soil on the planet. We've touched, I swear to God, every square millimeter of this. So what isn't disturbed? I don't think of anything as a weed. Actually, I think of the native coast live oak as a weed because they're trying to take over it. But no, I look at plants as plants.
So how do you perceive your vast eucalyptus culture?
Oh, you're asking. Okay, so this is another huge wellspring of urban legends. So early in my career at Stanford, we not only planted in the wildlands, but we moved down onto the main campus, which had been planted by Frederick Law Olmsted and Leland Stanford with vast numbers of eucalyptus. So I plugged into that 1989, 1990. And I heard from everybody how the eucalyptus were bad. And I accepted that for the first couple years that I did plantings. But then, I'm an observant guy and I remember almost everything people say. And so I heard those words would ring in my head and I would bicycle past the grove of eucalyptus trees that were literally across the street from the Stanford football stadium. And that grove of ukes had a solid understory of toyon, native bay, and native coast live oak.
There you go.
And I went, are we getting the right story? And then as I planted more oaks, I saw that there were eucalyptus that would grow where I couldn't get oak trees to grow. And I still remember the day on the wildland as I was looking at my oaks in one area and looking at a giant blue gum eucalyptus standing 150 feet tall, 300 feet away. And I thought, I think eucalyptus has a place here. And what I've observed since then also there were a set of events in 1990 in December. The Bay Area of California had its coldest recorded temperature. Palo Alto went to 16 degrees. And we were working in the Stanford Arboretum at that time planting oaks. We were going out every weekend. And during the time when the freeze occurred, and during one week period in December, we came back to our trees and saw 150-foot blue gum eucalyptus that the top half of the trees had died in the intervening 2 weeks. And it was that summer that the eucalyptus longhorn borer showed up. And in the summer of 1991, Stanford University was forced in the middle of a recession to do a major logging operation in their arboretum as half of their eucalyptus died. So I was at ground zero listening to the urban legends and watching what was happening on the ground and noting a profound disconnect.
Yeah, that is definitely a disconnect. When you think of California, I was just out there over the holiday time and, you look and you see these big eucalyptus and you just say, oh yeah, they're happy here. They seem to be as happy as can be, no matter what the weather conditions. But you do have these things that come through that will annihilate a lot of them.
I've watched in my time, 35 years, I think half or more of all the eucalyptus in California have died. And it may be higher. I'm now working in the groves around Santa Barbara, and the trees are just dropping like flies. When we have our heavy rains, they're falling over. Ukes are a vastly overrated threat. And the truth is, as we are searching for drought-adapted climate change trees for the cities of California, we're looking hard at the small eucalyptus that were only planted in small numbers that have no invasiveness and just grow anywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm not a fan of giant ukes, but as a world-renowned oak expert, I like eucalyptus, but they have to be used very carefully and very wisely.
Yeah. And, being out there again, just a short time ago, I was really impressed with your southern magnolias, how beautiful they are. And I know you might not think of them too well, but they're surprisingly durable in the places I saw them.
You're only seeing the survivor southern magnolias on the very best sites. If you did a population condition survey of the nearly 10,000 magnolias still alive in Palo Alto next to Stanford, you will find the average condition is poor. The trees are full of dead branches all over town. It's a hugely water-needy species that can only be used with heavy irrigation. I describe it as one of my nemesis trees because, you can have nice ones, but you're going to have to empty our reservoirs to keep them green. So I am the drought tolerance reality check who tends to say things that nobody wants to hear. But when you go out and check my observations in nature, nobody can argue. So
Yeah, and we saw these in LA and as a street tree, and they were in areas where they might get down drainage, or when it rains, they might get a little bit more water, or they might be along a street where somebody's going to empty something out, and they were doing fine. You're right, probably about the water situation.
Oh, I've watched personally thousands of southern magnolias die. I've planted close to 100,000 trees in California in projects that I was substantially involved in. I've never planted a single southern magnolia. I bicycled every street in Palo Alto for years and watched them. Let me give you one background that you can't see as a visitor to California. Almost all of our houses were built with giant lawns. Everything, every house in California until the 70s had a lawn, and until like the 90s, most of them did. So it was the lawns that supported the magnolias. And once the drought forced us to take out the lawns, that's when we saw the magnolia and many other water-needy trees planted in California. That's when us arborists saw the declines begin. Well, it's just the broader historical context that you can't see in a snapshot.
Right. And one of the things that I do know, because I have a couple clients out there, a really enthusiastic movement away from lawns, and especially in LA. And I was really surprised because we went up into the hills. I mean, people were getting rid of their lawns. I mean, you could actually see the planting of the native plants. And that was really a very happy thing for me to see. And with my background, I was like, oh yeah, they're getting it. They don't need to have a lawn. Their plant materials more than substantial, So that was really nice to see.
Yeah. By comparison to 40 years ago, there's 80% fewer lawns. It's big. And we didn't have the water to support lawns. And they'll be disappeared within a decade, pretty much. So.
Well, yeah. And the money that they're giving people, I think it's $5 a square foot in LA. If you convert your lawn to a garden with native plants, hey, who wouldn't want to do it? Because you're getting money to do a landscape that you probably don't want to do, but now you're encouraged to do. So it makes a huge difference. And you see resilient trees out there that you might not think about, but like we have trees here that, and I know you're probably going to turn your nose up when I say crepe myrtles, but they are very drought tolerant here, especially in the South. And go ahead.
So I'm going to surprise you again, because I do nothing but surprise people. My opinions are pure from the environment. They have no influence.
Right.
Crepe myrtle is one of the most successful trees ever planted in California. It is among the most drought-tolerant trees in our industry. But I should not be saying that. Everyone else in my industry is like, oh, crepe myrtles. Except they're planting red maples, which have way less drought tolerance. People don't seem to observe what's happening around them very often. And we want to go off somebody else's opinion rather than the evidence of our own eyes and brains. And that's not working out well, folks.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that. And, we have seen in a surge of planting of crepe myrtles. We've had a lot of hot, dry summers and drought tolerant. And boy, they bloom even more so because they're drought affected. Or in the South, when I went down to Richmond, I couldn't believe the amount of crepe myrtles that were planted along the streets in Richmond or Washington, D.C., or any of the southern states where they might get a series of droughts. The heat is what they can handle. They can handle the drought. Why not? And there's a lot of varieties of them too. So, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm boots on the ground. I just toured the campus in Alabama, Auburn, 2 days ago, and they are robust. They grow into handsome, medium-sized specimens, but they also handle a pollard extremely well. And that seems to culturally or otherwise a way that a lot of Southerners handle their crepe myrtles. But I agree with everything that's being said, Eva and Dave, that crepe myrtles are one of those trees that I think can solve a lot of problems.
So here in California, there's a weird problem because a lot of our sidewalk cutouts in our cities are like 3 feet and 4 feet. They're little tiny things.
That's what ours are.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's what everybody's are. But
haven't we learned?
Yeah, well, we aren't.
But crepe myrtles are perfect in those.
And in California, there are almost no drought-tolerant small trees available.
Right.
That's why I've started looking at eucalyptus. The smallest of the eucalyptus is to try to put trees that actually function into these hideous, undersized planting locations. So for now, given the lack of drought-tolerant tree material ridiculously in our nursery industry, I remain an advocate for crepe myrtles.
There you go. I mean, and I think you're right about observation. I was talking to a tissue culture person the other day when I had my class at one of the botanic gardens. And one of the things that she said is, sometimes people do an experiment and they're only here for 2 years, or when they're in the university, they're only there for 2 years and then they're gone and they never finish the project. And she said, one of the things that's really good about me doing my project is I'm doing it from start to finish and I get to see everything. And that's really true about so many different things, that people are not in an area long enough to see the track record of a tree or, whatever it is that they're doing. They're not there long enough to see the whole impression. And that's where the fallacy comes in. And you're right about you being where you are and you seeing what you see. You have observed over time what is successful and what's not. But you're probably also observing things, that those changes that are happening climatically that need to be addressed also, where somebody else wouldn't be.
I think you just described me in a really nice way. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, Dave, I want to make sure we leave some time for you to tell us about your time at Apple Park. And for those listeners that don't know, there's a couple nice profiles of you in terms of meeting Steve and moving forward with the pretty special collection that Apple Park has. I think one of the writers referred to it as a radically diverse species list. There are radically diverse plantings at Apple Park.
So I'm going to quickly run you guys through my career between the Oaks and Apple Park, because some critical things occurred. So in 1998, I started working for a nonprofit planting street trees. And I spent 2 years really intensively planting and studying street trees in Palo Alto. And in the process of doing that, I reviewed essentially every tree available in our nursery industry. And by the time I'd finished that review, I began badgering our city to plant new trees because it was clear to me our industry didn't have the right trees and we needed to begin experimentation.
Wow.
So I began pushing them into the available trees that they weren't already using that were drought tolerant, but there wasn't much. Now, cut another 5 years forward, and I'm back managing the oaks at the Stanford project.
Right.
And I'm seeing that the Valley oaks aren't doing that great. The blue oaks are just finished. And we've got like nothing in the nursery industry. And it's like, we need new trees, you guys. So what I ended up doing in 2003 was that I learned about the Shields Oak Grove at the University of California, Davis, which is the largest collection of oak trees west of the Mississippi. They're up to 100 oak taxa. And it was planted in the mid to late 60s. And that was the only place that I could find weird oaks to evaluate. So I went to Davis and I talked him into giving me all the maps and the accession lists. And I began a process of evaluating every tree there for growing in our cities, everything I could get acorns from. And some of those plantings from the mid-2000s at Stanford, we began a series of small plantings through Magic under contract with Stanford of totally weird things that I got from collectors around the country, from the Shields Grove in Davis. And we did 5 or 6 of those. I've just finished a report on those plantings for Stanford University. And it was fascinating because almost all of my first choices were misses. I've made all my mistakes in those first ones.
Okay.
And
Wow.
there were only a handful of trees that were any good from those plantings. I was doing the raw science. And when you're in an area that nobody knows anything about, and nobody knows anything about oaks. I mean, now that I'm down the wormhole, it's like, oh my God, I got to pull you people down with me. So,
Yeah.
yes. So I saw a few things that were thriving and a lot of things that didn't work. And based in that little bit of feedback, I realized, okay, skip the deciduous trees. Deciduous trees essentially have no future. Our climate is already pretty much subtropical, and it may be headed toward full tropical for all we know. So deciduous trees largely evolve for cold climates because their cells will burst below freezing, and that doesn't happen anymore. And a deciduous tree sheds its leaves in the winter. And in Santa Barbara today, it is full sun and 75 degrees, and any bare tree is losing out on prime photosynthesis. An evergreen tree can capture more energy than a deciduous tree in a warm winter climate, and there's essentially no place for deciduous trees in California. So I immediately went directly to evergreen species. And it was clear that it was up to me to go get the acorns because I couldn't even find any nurseries to buy this stuff from. And by that time, I was tapping the International Oak Society, all the most hardcore oak nerds in the world, including a guy out of the American Southwest who knew where all the cool trees were. So starting in 2008, I began collection trips into Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, in addition to all over California, to go try to find the trees that would be the future urban forest for California. And I went to Texas first because they had the most advanced experimentation into non-local oaks, where they were bringing Mexican species up and planting them into their cities. So I literally collected acorns off street medians in Dallas, out of parking lots in Tucson, out of the Peckerwood Gardens down near Houston, in the hill country of Texas, then keep going west into the Capitan Mountains of New Mexico, the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico, the Chiricahuas of Arizona, the Catalinas of Arizona. So to learn the trees that evolution would move to California if climate change was slow enough, I was the squirrel in a car with a smartphone and a computer. And I went and learned the trees in habitat because I couldn't find anybody who knew them. And so I learned their adaptations. I learned where they occurred. I learned where the seed happened. And then I started bringing the seeds back and growing them in a series of nurseries and getting them planted out and continuing the testing. Now I've brought you up to the moment I created a nursery called Utopia. In 2008, I collected 10,000 acorns of about 60 different kinds of oaks from all kinds of weird places and grew them on another little hippie commune up in Sonoma County. And that winter, the economy tanked out and I had lots of time on my hands. So I built a giant website, which is the previous version of Oaktopia. And I created it to sell the new trees because I realized nobody knew anything. So I had to build a giant web catalog for them. I had all the trees growing. I had a website built. And then unbeknownst to me, right within the next year or two, Steve Jobs went to his headhunters and said, "Find me Stanford's arborist." So the weirdest thing in the world is the whole time we were growing those oaks at Stanford and learning and they were succeeding, Steve Jobs was walking there like 3 or 4 times a week and he was watching us like a hawk and none of us knew it. So when Steve was ready to plant a 100-acre landscape around a giant glass spaceship, he told his headhunters to find me Stanford's arborist. And so I got a call in June of 2010 from the headhunters saying, "Hey, Steve Jobs is looking for an arborist for a new campus. Do you want to talk to us?" Yes, it was the fastest yes of my life. So I interviewed with the headhunters and they liked me enough. I didn't hear anything for like 6 weeks. And I was like, wow, are they going to call me back? What's going to happen? Suddenly I get a call. I've got an interview with Steve Jobs. And that was like one of the craziest moments of my life. And I interviewed with Steve Jobs more or less a year to the day before he died. And there was a funny moment. All of my friends were like, "Oh my God, you're going to interview with Steve? Aren't you nervous?" I'm like, "I'm not nervous at all. The outcome of this interview is already known. It's all based in both of our histories. There's nothing I'm going to do this weekend that's going to change a thing. I just need to go in and talk to Steve and find out if what I got is what he needs." And so I went to Steve and we like instantly synchronized. And it was then that I sold the concept, finally getting back to your question, of megadiversity. So Steve Jobs, one of his best friends was Al Gore. Steve Jobs knew all about climate change because he'd been schooled by Al Gore. So Al Gore plowed a field for me to plant seeds in. And I said to Steve, we want it to look like around here, but we have to diversify into the face of climate change. We're just like a monetary investor who is staring into a period of economic uncertainty. Your best strategy is to hedge your bets with diversity. Steve just nodded. So that was where we started. So I was hired at Apple about 6 months later, and there was no landscape architect yet. So I found out that they interviewed 35 landscape architects for Apple Park. Steve said no to 34 in a row. They only interviewed one arborist, just me. And you can go look at the results to see how Steve did. So that was the beginning. And once I was hired, I immediately began putting together the biggest tree list anybody'd ever seen in California. I built giant spreadsheets. I made a book of them. And then when the Olin partnership was eventually hired, we just handed the whole tree list to them. And Olin was terrified that they would be forced to plant an all-native palette. But we were in the middle of Cupertino. There were 3 miles of solid suburbia on all sides of us between us and anything that even resembled wildland. Yeah. There was no escape going to happen. The only creek was channelized concrete.
Yes.
So it was a safe experimental site. And we were allowed to massively diversify. So Olin was really happy that they didn't have to have an all-native palette. But the core, so kind of the general concept is we planted 9,000 trees. Nearly half of them were oaks. So with the oaks, the way we divided it up was about 25% of the tree planting was local native. The next 25% was regional natives, which for us meant other California natives.
Right.
Then the next 25% were long-term regional migration species. So that reached down into the American Southwest and northwestern Mexico. So the third category was the Southwest and Mexico. And then the last category was just oaks and trees from all over the world that were proven to grow based in long-term experimentation. So in the end, we planted about 135 total tree taxa. 35 of those were for 1,000 tree fruit orchard that I designed that had 35 different varieties. So you'd have sequential ripening so the fruit could be used in the cafeteria.
Beautiful. Yeah.
But of the ornamental or biodiversity trees, there were about 100 types, and 60 of those were oaks. So we only have, by a loose count, about 20 kinds of oaks in California. Most of the oaks we used were far from outside California, and most of those were grown from acorns that I collected as all the places that I've named before. So we brought in some of the trees that I'd grown in my little hippie nursery, and then I went out and did collections while I was an employee. And then I got to have the biggest nursery in the state grow my acorns in state-of-the-art air pruning containers to eliminate the defects that have ruined drought-tolerant trees in California for more than half a century. So the trees of Apple Park were unique types. In many cases, they had never been grown in California before, and most of them had never been grown in quantity. So essentially, Steve Jobs gave me the go-ahead to do an enormous horticultural experiment. And luckily, it was a well enough founded experiment that I got it through all the peer review and the building process. And you can go look at Apple Park now. Of all those trees, there were only 2 or 3 types that didn't work.
Just a quick question that I have to ask in light of drought. How do those trees at Apple Park get their irrigation?
So, remember my story about soil?
Yes.
Oh, so I advocated soil preparation at Apple Park that no one had ever heard of. There was one area where they gave me 10 feet of decompacted soil. So my long-term strategy, all the trees were drought tolerant. None of my long-term plantings are irrigated. Every planting I do is intended to have the water turned off within the first 5 years, if not within the first 3.
Right.
Okay,
right.
That's very illuminating.
Yeah. No, I don't mess around. You want to use the best trees of the best species in the best soils. And then your irrigation system, it needs to be a permanent system because you never know when we're going to go into a 5-year mega drought.
Yeah.
So you just leave the establishment irrigation system in place as the emergency drought system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so all this experimentation and observation as a younger person getting out of school and observing paid off huge dividends in the end.
When I talk to young horticulturists, and they're often wowed by my knowledge and experience, I just tell them, start observing. Don't accept anything anyone tells you unless you can confirm it with your own two eyes. Because our industry is full of urban legends and even outright lies. Observation, observation, observation.
Very good advice.
Yeah, I hate to be that guy, Dave, but you do have a book in you. I'm sure you're a busy guy, but between your story about Apple, Stanford, and Oaks, I don't know, maybe 135 pages. It doesn't have to be Richard Powers, but,
You need
there's
to
a
do
lot
it.
to share.
You need to do
My
it.
website is already kind of a book. And the truth is, John Perlin of A Forest Journey.
Love him. Love him.
We have lunch every week, and he's just badgering me to write a book with him. So,
well, write a book with him. Write a book with him.
I'm moving in that direction pretty fast.
I just read one of his updates to his book. He sent me a chapter, and he said, "Let me know what you think." And I read it. So we're going to have him back on, but he's much like you in that he just keeps digging. He keeps digging and constantly keeps observing. And that's really how people not only stay on top of their profession, but keep their mind really sharp and young. That's the key.
Yes.
That's the key.
Total agreement.
Resiliency, as the Oaktopia website
Yes, resiliency
points out. We have to ask you your favorite tree. And I know it's redundant to a certain extent, but where do you stand with having a favorite tree or group of trees or species or spirit tree?
Here's an opportunity to say one important thing I haven't said so far. So my alignment is strong with the oaks. And the reason is that oaks are the underpinning of biodiversity through the entire mid-latitudes of the whole planet. In the northern hemisphere, from the equator almost to the boreal forest, the oaks underpin biodiversity. And we are terrifyingly in the midst of a very fast mass extinction event. So I've aligned in part with oaks because I am hoping to create migrational habitats for the organisms on the planet that are evacuating their burning homes and moving either uphill or toward the poles in an attempt to survive the rapid changes. So that's sort of a deep philosophy, is that I kind of feel like I'm doing this for the squirrels and the jays and the little kids. And yeah, really for me, it's the oaks and not really any particular one.
Okay, so
very good.
So
very
you
good,
just opened up a new category for us, right, Hal?
Genus?
The new category is what's your favorite genus?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Good answer, though, in terms of the supplemental philosophy that you offered. It makes a lot of sense. And we really loved having you. We love all our guests from California are special.
They are. The West Coast in general has been, I would say, extremely fertile and lots of wonderful information that it kind of counterbalances what's happening here in the East. I mean, there's lots of things that are happening all over the country, but I think you've given us a good balance of, what we need to be observant of too here in our region.
I just want to give a shout out to California hippies too, because, they take a lot of heat that they didn't get it done. But it seems like now that trees are back in the conversation, the hippie culture was a strong influence.
Well, there you have it. Well, thank you again for being on our podcast, Dave. And
thanks, Dave.
You bet.
Take care.
It's been great.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromeda Recordings in Hollywood, California.